Hello, 6th grade. This is Mrs. Brinkley again. I'm back and we are going to continue to learn about multiplying and dividing integers. This time we're going to try to do it without models. We're going to relate it to the way we spoke about modeling, like groups of things, and then we're going to talk about the word opposite again. You're going to need your notes page that is printed out for you, and you also need your notebook. Number 1 has negative 15 times 4. So I'm going to start by circling my negative, and I'm going to remind myself that this means the opposite of 15 groups. The opposite of 15 groups, and this is a positive 4 of positive 4. So the first thing I have to do is find 15 groups of positive 4. Now, if I have 15 groups and there's only positives inside of my groups, then I know that the answer to this is going to be a positive. So then I would just take 15 times 4, and I get 60. So I know that this is positive 60, and then I need to remember to go back and take the opposite of that. So the opposite of positive 60 is negative 60. Number 2. Number 2 is the reason why we have to do this without models, because the more we work with integers, the more complex our numbers would become, and it's things that I wouldn't want to draw out. I definitely do not want to draw out 31 groups. So I'm going to start by circling my negatives, and I'm going to rewrite it. So this means the opposite of 31 groups of, and that was a negative 7. 31 groups of negative 7. Well, if I'm imagining my 31 groups drawn out, and I know that there's 7 negatives inside of each group, that means that all of my drawing is negatives. So this would be negative. 31 groups of negative 7 will give me a negative value. So let's pretend like that's not there, and let's just multiply 31 times 7. 7 times 1, 7 times 3, so that's 217. So 31 groups of negative 7 is negative 217. And then I have to remember to go back and do the opposite of that. So the opposite of negative 217 is positive 217. What about division? So let's start here. This one is 18 divided by negative 3. And in this case, my 18 is positive, and I need to divide it into the opposite of 3 groups. So it's 18 total split into the opposite of 3 groups. So we're going to do 18 split into 3 groups first. So 18 divided by 3 is 6. Well, if these are positives, the only thing that could be in my groups, in my 3 groups, are positives. So this is positive 6. And then I need to remember to go back and do the opposite of that. So the opposite of positive 6 is negative 6. Now remember, division can be represented as a number divided by a number, or it could be represented in a fraction form where it's the top divided by the bottom, or the numerator divided by the denominator. So we can rewrite this as negative 20 divided by negative 4. And if you can already know this, the reason I put parentheses around this is not because of order of operations. It's because I want this negative to stand out and make sure that you can see that it's the different symbol than the division sign. So rewriting this, this would be 20 negatives split into the opposite, because this is the opposite, of 4 groups. So again, if we take the 20 negatives, split it into 4 groups, the only thing that's in my 4 groups are negatives. So I know my value here is negative. So 20 divided by 4 is 5. So negative 20 divided into 4 groups is negative 5, and I have to remember to take the opposite of that. So the opposite of negative 5 is positive 5. Now I realize that this can be a little bit confusing, so one of the things that I want you to do with me is we're going to move over to our notebook and we're going to kind of see if we can come up with some rules. Now I'm not going to tell you the rules. You might already know them, you might be guessing them by now, but what I would like you to do is by the end of this assignment, I'm hoping that you can come up with some general rules for yourself so that you can figure out when is the product or the quotient going to be a negative value and when is the product or the quotient going to be a positive value. To do that, I would like to point out one more thing and give you a little bit of a hint. So one of the things that I asked you to do was to circle your values, your negatives. So I'm going to rewrite this problem right here into my notebook so I can show you what I'm talking about. So I have negative 31 times negative 7. And the first thing that I asked you to do was to circle your negatives. Now, what we've been doing is saying the opposite of a group of negatives, which is one way to solve it. But I can also say that this means the opposite of the opposite. And then I can pretend like there's no negatives and say 31 times 7. Now we already said that 31 times 7 is 217. So now that I've done that, I can remember that every time I have an opposite, I have 217, I need to take the opposite of that. So the first time I've taken an opposite of that, I'm going to end up with a negative value. So I've taken this opposite, and then I'm going to have to take the opposite of that value because I have another negative. So the opposite of a negative 217 is back to a positive 217. So my answer is again a positive 217, which is the same thing I got here, but I did it a little bit differently. So now I've had to do the opposite twice. So you can either use the opposite whenever there's a negative in front, or a negative number of groups, I should say, because it's not always in the front here. But you could use the word opposite, and instead of having to figure out, well, what is this value? 31 groups of negative 7, is that a positive or a negative? Instead of having to figure that out, you could multiply and then take the opposite for the opposite values, or for the negative values. Whichever way is more convenient to you, is more efficient for you, is fine. But now that you've seen this, I'm wondering if you can try to figure out the answer to my question. When is a product or a quotient going to be a negative value versus when is a product or quotient a positive value? So what I would like you to do is, you have 8 problems. We have 4 multiplication problems and 4 division problems to try on your own. When you're done with those, I would like you to take in your notebook, right under this little bit of work that we did, and you're going to write a sentence. And you're going to describe to me, when do you think that a product or a quotient will be a negative value? And when do you think that a product or quotient will be a positive value? As you look at your work, I want you to see if you can prove that or disprove it if it ends up being incorrect. Now, as mathematicians, it's okay to be incorrect. I just want you to think about it and consider, what do I think will always work? What is a rule that I can say will work for all integers when we multiply and divide? All right, I'm looking forward to working with you again. Please don't forget to work on these independently, and be sure to get your work checked by your teacher before moving on to your IXL practice.